Okay, season 2, here we come.
The Kardashians are back on Hulu.
We're back, in case you missed us.
This September.
We are starting to talk wedding dresses.
Everything gets elevated.
I do believe in love. When you love, you know you're alive. You have these feelings.
No matter how crazy things are, we're always going to be family.
Now hold your crown up.
The Kardashians Season 2, now streaming only on Hulu.
Hey, it's me, your Uncle Cooper. Sorry to interrupt your music. I do love music, especially when it's set at a reasonable volume. You know, music is really only as good as your speakers. The same is true for minivans. A minivan is only as good as the tires it sits on. And the button on the screen there, it agrees with me. If you click on it, it'll bring you to all the Cooper minivan tires that'll make your minivan a really good minivan. Go with the Coopers! Cooper!
Hey folks, welcome to the Adventure Sports Podcast. I'm your host, Mason. Before we jump into the episode, I did want to tell you that we are doing a listener survey right now. So in the show notes, you can find a link to a survey where we just want to get some insights from listeners about what you're liking about the show, what you don't like about the show, what we can change, anything you've seen in other shows you want to hear in our show. So if you don't mind, fill that out. We're going to be making some changes here soon and would love your input ahead of that. Also, for anyone that does fill it out, there's going to be a little thank you at the end, a little discount code you can use around the internet. So go ahead and do that. That would be a huge help, and we'd love to hear from y'all. So talking about today's episode, we're talking to Rob Hutchings, and Rob does a really cool thing. He does all kinds of adventures, but the one we're talking about today is along the Clutha River in New Zealand, which is where he's joining us from. He's not from New Zealand, as we'll hear, but he decided to move there and jump headfirst into the adventure scene and do something that no one had ever done, which is swim almost 5 days down a river with rapids and basically backpack like a trail or bike tour, but on a river where you're swimming down the river, you get out and you camp, and then you go back in the next day and keep going. Obviously, he's not carrying all that gear on his back. He has someone helping him coordinate the gear, but nonetheless, it is a really cool concept. And also, if you're interested in his entire adventure story, he's a really good writer and wrote a book recently called Downriver Nomad, a triathlete's adventures and adversities into the rapids. And I bought it myself. So I don't always buy the book of the guest, but I bought this one and I've been reading it and I've really enjoyed it. He goes into his story, some of the adventures he's done. Because, with this show, we have so many people who've done tons of adventures, but I like to focus on talking about one on the episode. It makes a really good episode when you can focus on one adventure. But frankly, a lot of these people probably have 6 or 7 podcast episodes in them from adventures they've done, and Rob is one of those people. So I encourage you to check that out. But yeah, let's hear more about what it was like to swim the Clutha in New Zealand. So here we go. All right, folks, welcome to the Adventure Sports Podcast. You heard a little bit about Rob's story in the intro, but Rob, I want to welcome you to the show. How you doing?
Great. Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
Yeah. So you said it's early in the morning for you. Where are you coming from?
Yeah, my accent won't give it away, but I'm in Christchurch, New Zealand.
Oh, no kid. Is that where you're from?
No, I'm from a town called Cornerbrook, Newfoundland in Canada, but I've had a bit of a nomadic life. I've lived in 5 countries, Australia, Britain, and Singapore briefly, and now New Zealand, as far as I can tell, is my permanent home.
I hear great things about it, so not a bad home to have. You see that for the foreseeable future. What about New Zealand makes it, I don't know, maybe a step above the rest, or is it just where you feel like settling?
It is where I feel like settling. I mean, I've had a pretty nomadic life, and I still really, really love adventure travel and traveling in general. But I've moved around so much. The main reason is I just really, really love New Zealand. It's got everything I want on my doorstep here, from the swimming and mountain biking and all the alpine running that I do. There's huge numbers of mountains, rivers, and lakes, just, easy access, being a small country. But, unlike Canada and the United States, it's just such a compact place and pretty easy to get to pretty much anywhere you want to go. And I've lived here 4 years, and my search for an ugly place in New Zealand remains a failure. Everywhere I go seems absolutely spectacular.
There's nowhere to go that isn't pleasing to the eye.
That's right.
Never been, but that's what I hear. And we've had a lot of adventures on this show that have run across New Zealand or biked across New Zealand. It's the same thing. It's just a very compact area of things to see and things to do.
Yeah, it's a wonderful place to have adventures. The mountains are not quite as big as, say, the Rockies. New Zealand just has this amazing trail network and incredible places for marathon swimming. I mean, there's huge numbers of, in such a small country, there's a large number of glacial lakes. And, of course, I'm into the river swimming. And just the fresh, pristine water that runs out of the lakes and towards the ocean is just absolutely mind-boggling. And the scenery, you just can't beat it.
Oh man, that's awesome! Gosh, I'd love to go. So how did you end up there? Tell us a little bit about that. What is your nomadic lifestyle? What is that? Because you've mentioned that a couple times.
Yeah, well, like I said, I'm from a town called Corner Brook, Newfoundland, in Canada, and I started my triathlon days there. And my hometown just happens to have a really big triathlon. We've actually hosted the national championships in Canada twice, and a couple of times we hosted the ITU World Cup. That's the International Triathlon Union. But I'm a chiropractor, and I did my chiropractic education in England. And I've always just had this weird fascination with maps, and just really, really love travel. It stems from my mother hanging this enormous map up in her dining room, and she used to play this map game with us, what she called it. She'd give me 2 letters, and the game was to find a country that begins with the first letter and a city within the country that begins with the second. So that gave me a early knowledge of geography, and I just have always retained this fascination with maps. And decided when I was about 5 or 6 years old I was going to move to Australia because I wanted to see kangaroos and koalas. Well, that happened. And I have an Australian wife, and we lived in Australia together for 15 years. And after a brief stint in Singapore, we actually moved to New Zealand by accident. I was on the phone with a friend of mine who I work with. He runs the clinic that I work in Christchurch, and he said he just told me casually he was looking for a new chiropractor, and just sounded great. And I just said, that sounds fantastic, I'll do it. And we agreed, and shortly after I hung up the phone and realized I'd offered to move to yet another country without consulting my wife. But but very fortunately, she immediately thought that was a fantastic idea, and she loves New Zealand as well. So and she picked up work, so it worked out really well.
No kidding. Oh, I love it. Yeah, that can get you in a lot of trouble moving to another country without consulting your spouse. I've never done that, but my first piece of advice would be to tell them. But it worked out for you. Worked out for the better.
I definitely recommend consulting the wife before you take a job offer. I mean, obviously, I could have backed out of it, but as soon as I said it to her, my wife I'm very fortunate. She's one of the most chilled out women on the planet, and her exact reaction with her Australian twang, I said, "Hey, honey, remember Jim, the guy I work with? He offered me a job in Christchurch. What do you think?" And she goes, "Yeah, all right, let's do that." So it was no problem.
That's I know a couple Australians. That sounds very Australian. That's all right, let's do that. Too funny, man. She was just all down for it. That's awesome. So how long have y'all been there? And it sounds like you enjoyed it enough that you want to stick around.
Yeah, I'm going to apply for citizenship. You got to be here 5 years to apply for citizenship. We've been here just over 4 now. We arrived in 2018. In retrospect, I probably would have moved here sooner, but really grateful for all the chapters of my life. But, I've really enjoyed my time in Australia. For both my wife and I, it's turned into home. We're both really at home here. The adventure culture is amazing. And plus, like Newfoundland, where I grew up, which is a lot of Irish and Scottish descent, good old-fashioned hospitality is very much alive and well here, and that is something that really appeals to me as well. I moved here in my 40s, so it's really easy to make friends with all the runners and swimmers and triathletes, and it really was the right move.
Oh, that's too cool. Well, good for y'all. I'm happy to hear that it's turned out to be such a good move. Well, tell us a little bit about the adventures. Have you been doing these adventures all throughout all these places you've lived? I know you have a background in triathlons, but tell it. Yeah, I guess start there. Tell us a little bit about your adventure background, how you got into these things. Was it first triathlons and then other things? Where did it start?
Yeah, I mean, I was always a really active little kid, but the most athletically untalented person on the planet. I joke sometimes my genetics resemble a hippopotamus.
Hey, them things can move, though.
Yeah,
they can move.
They can. I didn't realize it, but they're actually really fast swimmers and fast runners. So in a triathlon, your only chance of beating a hippo is when you're on the bike. But yeah, no, the very brief story is that I tried baseball and basketball, and despite hard work, there's no chance I can be trained to aim a ball at a target. It just can't work. And I like team sports. I'm just no good at them. And I started swimming. And what I liked about swimming immediately when I was in grade 8, I think I was not quite 13 at the time, didn't matter if you weren't that good. You get to race. Like I was a bench warmer in basketball. Yeah, you get to participate when you're on the swim team. A couple of triathletes really caught my eye, and I went up to one of them. His name was Jamie Merrigan. He was the top junior in my hometown at the time, and I realized he was a triathlete, and he was 5 years older than me. So when you're a teenager, that's a big age difference. So I went up to him with all the confidence I could muster and said, "Hey, I want to be a triathlete like you." And he was immediately really nice and took me under his wing, so to speak. And within a few years, of training together, like I could start to keep up with him. And a whole mess of the other triathletes in town formed a network there. And I was really competitive up until my late 30s, doing triathlon of all distances. And I had adventures mixed in there, like we had a big trip to Mongolia and Bhutan and stuff like that. But when I moved to New Zealand, I felt my competitive nature kind of waning. And I still really love multisport and triathlon, and marathon swimming. So what I started doing was just making up my own adventures and just making sure I also see the beautiful sights that are around here rather than trying to get through it all every time as fast as possible. So, when I'm running up a mountain, I'm quite, happy to stand on top of the mountain for a while and soak it up. And recently I swam New Zealand's really iconic Milford Sound, which is an absolutely stunning fjord. And there was a couple of times in that 6-hour swim that I just had to stop and just marvel and look around at where I was, and dolphins swimming around me. So still push the limits of endurance, but I still compete in the odd triathlon as well, but just really more into the adventure multisport and often self-made adventures rather than, competition.
So that's what I want to get into is taking the pieces of triathlon and turning them into kind of running with it, or not literally swimming with it, not running with it. But tell us about some of these adventures of swimming. Like you talk about the Milford Sound. When did you start focusing on just doing the swimming itself, or some of your more recent adventures?
Well, it's fair to say in triathlon I was always a better swimmer, and I was kind of a dual sport. Triathlon in itself is 3 sports, but I was also a marathon swimmer throughout my whole competitive time. So I really enjoy marathon swimming, and the only gripe I ever had with triathlon is the swim is relatively short in all the distances. So what I started doing was often making up these multi-day triathlons where I do a full day marathon swim, for example, in one of the big glacial lakes or in the fjord. The day after the fjord swim that we did, my wife and I went on a 2-week cycle tour. And so that's kind of a, 2/3 of a triathlon. So I wanted to do marathon swimming, but I didn't want to lose out on cycling and running, even though it's fair to say I'm better at swimming. And I just, when I'm not in the water, I love being in the mountains. What I often do is make up a 2 or 3 day triathlon when I don't have a whole lot of, vacation time. Might do a big marathon swim, and then the next day, either a bike or a run, or sometimes a bike and run the second day. And, when I have more time, I make up triathlon events, and not necessarily in the correct triathlon order. It just depends on what the geography is at the time. And, doing, 5, 6, 7 day. And I have a theory that I'll one day swim New Zealand's Fovo Strait, which is right down at the bottom, Stewart Island, which is a really remote island off the coast of South Island. And there's a really big hiking track around there that would take you about, there's one version of it that's 5 or 6 days, and the other one's 11 or 12. So I thought, all right, well, swim the Fovo, and then run or power hike the trek, afterwards. So that's the sort of adventures I've got in mind going forward. And I've, done a lot of that already. And I often do my swimming where a lot of triathletes won't venture, such as the rivers and in the glacial lakes, where I found out I was the first one to cross them. I was a bit surprised I was the first one to cross a few of them. I didn't realize when I did it, but afterwards found out I was the first one to swim across what's called Lake Coleridge, which is an elevated glacial lake in the Canterbury High Country, and the second person to swim Lake Tekapo, which is a 26K lake a bit further south from Christchurch, and just absolutely, crystal blue water. It's hard to describe just how beautiful these places are.
Yeah, what I'm so interested to learn more about is what gives you, I don't know, the confidence. It seems really scary to move somewhere new and to swim across these lakes. Is there any real danger when it comes to swimming in the lakes in particular? I know the glaciated lakes, maybe not so much, but anything to worry about? Or are you just confident enough? It's in the bays as well.
Well, I'll get to the rivers shortly, but in the lakes, I mean, one thing about New Zealand, I often joke that it's like Canada without the bears. And, the wildlife in New Zealand is actually really tame. It's a really rugged, mountainous, alpine country, but there's nothing out here that thinks you look like lunch. So in the lakes, there's nothing dangerous in the lakes. I mean, obviously you got to be careful with, keeping warm. In my case, being a redhead with freckles, from Newfoundland, Canada, where the sun comes out a handful of times a year, I got to be careful with sun protection. I've made friends with a lot of kayakers, and the way that started was, when I first moved, I was like, let's go in these Facebook groups that I joined that are, just adventure groups, trail running and the like, and there's lots of kayakers in New Zealand, so I just said, hey, I want to swim across Lake Coleridge. That seems like a good idea. Anyone willing to support me? And I mentioned the hospitality culture of New Zealand, and it just seemed really, really easy to get kayak support. So every time I go swim across a big lake, I'll have kayak support. And, one of the cool things about making up your own self-made adventures is, there's no entry fee. It was actually my wife. I've done these fairly expensive adventures in the past. We'll keep doing that now and again, but there's only so many, really expensive things you can do each year. My wife said to me on our first trip to Lake Tekapo, we were just down there having fun. Wasn't there for a swim that particular time. And she said, look, if you swam across that would be amazing. And would you have a worse time than if you spent lots of money and all it would cost you to swim across that is a hotel room and buy your kayak supporter a pizza? And that seemed very logical to me, and that's what I've been doing. And, when I'm doing marathon swims, most of the people around here aren't generally crazy enough to want to swim where I do. A few of them are, but now and again I get someone else to swim with me. It's no problem to get for the mountain biking and the trails in the mountains. Plenty of people in New Zealand do that, so I've made lots of alpine friends. So often I'll be there the day before them for an alpine run, and I've just done a swim the day before. And then we go out, running up places like Avalanche Peak and what's called the Edge Track, and it's called the Edge for a reason, and stuff like that.
Wow. That's too cool. I love that it was your wife's. You gave her a really good idea. She gave you a really good idea. So yeah. For you, how do you it says that you've transitioned more into doing these adventure-based things versus organized events. Do you find it as you get older more rewarding to do things that you plan and execute yourself, and maybe you're the only person doing, versus an event with potentially thousands of people?
Let's take a quick message break and hear from the folks that help make this show possible.
Okay, season 2, here we come.
The Kardashians are back on Hulu.
We're back, in case you missed us.
This September,
We are starting to talk wedding dresses.
everything gets elevated.
I do believe in love. When you love, you're alive. You have these feelings.
No matter how crazy things are, we're always going to be family.
Now hold your crown up.
The Kardashians Season 2, now streaming only on Hulu.
Hey, it's me, your Uncle Cooper. Sorry to interrupt your music. I do love music, especially when it's set at a reasonable volume. Music is really only as good as your speakers. The same is true for minivans. A minivan is only as good as the tires it sits on. And the button on the screen there, it agrees with me. If you click on it, it'll bring you to all the Cooper minivan tires that'll make your minivan a really good minivan. Go with the Coopers! Cooper!
That is plenty of that for now. Let's get back into the episode.
Yeah, I mean, I still like doing the occasional event, but what I found is that my preference for all the endurance sport is, taking something that anywhere between 3 to 7 days long is my preferred length. I don't often get a crazy amount of holiday time, but, when I get longer holidays, I often do cycle touring after doing a marathon swim, and my wife and I cycle tour together. And hiking as well, which we call tramping down in New Zealand, by the way. We used to think it was called hiking or trekking, but it turns out the language is tramping down here. Yeah, I found a lot of satisfaction in doing these self-made, organized adventures. Often I'm the only or one of the only people to ever do it, and specifically the rivers that I swim down, most notably New Zealand's most powerful river, which is 256 kilometers long. Can't translate that into miles for you, but it took 5 days to do. And the Buller River and the Waimakuri River Gorge. I'm the only one to ever swim those particular rivers. The Clutha River, that swim took me a long time to train for and a long time to organize, and getting the logistics right for that. River swimming isn't quite as simple as just jumping in a river and going for it. I mean, there's a lot of safety and a lot of logistics to coordinate, and it was very, very satisfying to do that. So yeah, it's fair to say I prefer, even though it's a lot of work, organizing these adventures myself gives me a lot of satisfaction, just having pulled it off. And then, of course, seeing all the sights I do when I'm doing them. And, of course, I still have that endurance sport, love pushing the limits of endurance. So that's what I've been mainly focused on, with the occasional competition thrown in there.
You're just living the lifestyle. I love it. Absolutely love it. Too cool. I want to jump into the Clutha River adventure. That one, it seemed like a really daunting thing to plan, daunting thing to pull off. Like you said, 256 kilometers, which is around 160 miles of river swimming. Tell us about that river, because I know you said it's the most powerful, or like the strongest river in New Zealand, second longest river in New Zealand. What are you saying when you say it's the strongest river, and what does that mean to swim through it? Because it sounds dangerous, but you tell us the planning aspect of ensuring you were going to be able to actually physically do this.
Well, river swimming was born with me. I actually did an event, which was, only a handful of people did it. There's down in the Fjordland, which is the southeast corner, there's a river called the Waiau River, which is about 22 or 23K long. And that was my first river swim that I did in 2000 and I can't remember if it was 18 or 19 off the top of my head. That particular river was actually a filming site for the Lord of the Rings. I don't recall the name of the river in the movie, but that was the filming site. So I thought, right, well, I got to go swim that. And I just caught the river swimming bug immediately. Then after that particular event was over, I asked the race director, because I was still, new in New Zealand. I asked him, what other rivers here are deep enough to swim in New Zealand, and I hadn't actually seen the Clutha at that time. He told me you'd probably get away with swimming the upper 40K of the Clutha, but, he said, it's probably too long to think about swimming the whole length of it. And I said, okay, we'll see about that. And then my next move was to call the what they call the harbor master. I'm not sure if we call them harbor masters, but the aquatic managers in different regions, they're called harbor masters in New Zealand. I'm not sure if we call them that in North America. Can't remember. But I called him, and, with my accent, of course, he just thought I was probably the dumbest tourist to ever call him. And I said, hey, I got this idea. I want to swim from the town of Wanaka, which is a beautiful alpine town where the Clutha River has its outlet from the beautiful Lake Wanaka. And I want to swim all the way to the Pacific. And I think it'll take 5 or 6 days to do that. What do you think? And he literally said that would be impossible, and only an idiot would try it. So I hung up the phone and said, well, okay, well, I'm that kind of idiot. I'll see if we can give this a go.
Did he tell you why? Did he tell you why he thought it was impossible?
No one had ever done it. No one had probably even thought of it. And there's a lot of rapids. There's, a lot of twists and turns. And, there's nothing in there that's going to eat you. Like, there's no dangerous wildlife. But I guess he thought that, no swimmer would ever think to swim through rapids. Kiwis call it the mighty Clutha, and there's a good reason for that. There are quiet sections of the Clutha, like pretty much every river. There's, there's sections where it's pretty tame, But the rougher sections and the hairpin bends, the giant whirlpools, there's a place called Devil's Nook that's appropriately named, and that's the place where all the kayak tourists, not all, more kayak tourists need to be rescued at Devil's Nook than anywhere else in the Clutha. So basically river swimming, it is a thing. I mean, other people have swam other rivers, and I got lots of plans to swim, rivers around the world, I hope. Yeah, you might think it's easy because you're going with the current, but river swimming, because your arm is actually going against the oncoming current as you're doing your stroke, it's actually harder work. Plus, you had to be ready to sprint because, like most endurance sport, you're aiming to hold a pretty constant pace the whole time you're going. But in river swimming, because you got to dodge rocks, you got to get through rapids, you got to sprint to the left, sprint to the right to get around twists and turns and sprint out of the whirlpools and the undertows, things like that. You're doing an endurance sport event. In my case, the Clutha took 5 days, 4.5 actually. It is something that for big sections of it, it's not just going at a constant pace. You're sprinting. So the harbor master was right that it would be a very daunting task, and if you weren't really prepared, it would be extremely dangerous. But with my years of marathon swimming, and I've always just really loved rough water swims. Most triathletes, when they show up to the lake or the ocean or wherever the swim's being held, if there's either bit of chop in the water, most triathletes are moaning. And I just actually really love rough water swimming. I always loved rough water oceans and big chops out in the lake. So when I got into river swimming through rapids just felt like home. I just had this weird comfort in rough water, and I don't really find it daunting at all. I mean, obviously there's a limit to that. I mean, you wouldn't swim down the most powerful grade 5 rapids in the world or anything like that. But the Clutha has grade 3. My kayakers, I had one kayaker scouting ahead, and he had a VHF radio, and a kayaker who was with me, pretty much right next to me the whole time. He'd say, right, there's a big rapid coming up, push him to the left, push him to the right, or, there's a left turn, or there's a rock we got to dodge, go to the river right. And then she'd relay those instructions to me, and then, did whatever they told me to, and had, really good team with me. And you wouldn't do this sort of thing alone. I mean, I do think that if I jumped in the river by myself, that would be foolish. I wouldn't recommend that to anybody. But with the kayak support, and my wife drove the support van, and she was in constant communication with the kayakers the whole time, except for a few of the remote sections where there wasn't radio signal. And yeah, I mean, it was just an absolutely incredible adventure. And I mentioned that Wanaka is an alpine town, and now that New Zealand's opening up again after COVID and all that, I'd certainly recommend, if you're going to come to New Zealand, think about coming to Wanaka, nearby Queenstown, if you're an adventurer. And it's just really diverse because you start in an alpine territory, and there's 2 gorges you swim through, and what's called the Roxburgh Gorge. If there was a river on the moon, that would what it would look like. Just completely different than what you see in the alpine territory. And then as you approach the Pacific, the river, it's through rolling hills and just absolutely stunning scenery the whole time that you're going. But it's very different. Like I say, starting with alpine through gorges, rolling hills, vineyards, it's just absolutely unreal.
Wow. So I've got to ask this. Crazy idea. It's definitely a crazy idea to swim the whole river. I've never really talked to anybody that did that on this show. Maybe we have, but not that I recall. One of my questions was going to be, how did you have support? And you answered that with having a kayaker up ahead and then one next to you, kind of relaying. That makes a lot of sense. But what I was surprised by was hearing that it's harder to paddle because you're pulling against the current when you're on your backstroke. Are you able to at all use the momentum of the river? Obviously, you're floating, but how much is that helping you versus how much you have to actually do yourself?
I mean, obviously, you go fast because, there's the river current. But the amount of hard work you're doing, I mean, you could theoretically float down the river, but that's not what I wanted to do. So, yeah, I mean, like I say, when you're doing freestyle, your arm is going against the oncoming current as you're doing your stroke underwater. So that is, relatively speaking, harder work. And like I say, the sprinting in there, that adds to the hard work, really irregular times. So, the way you feel after you've had a swim like that is very different than, for example, swimming across a lake where the water's not moving, or at worst a headwind that you might have. Like I say, people did ask me are you going up or down river? And I always joke that I found it a bit flattering that there would be people that think I could go upstream against the Clutha. I mean, Michael Phelps couldn't do that. But yeah, swimming downriver, I just find absolutely great fun. And like I say, in a straight river, I mean, obviously you can float down, but I mean, if you were not that strong a swimmer, you wouldn't float down the Clutha because there's just so many twists and bends. If you weren't a good swimmer and in terms of being able to sprint whenever you wanted, you'd smash into the riverbanks or into rocks or something like that. You wouldn't be no one sits in the river in the Clutha and just floats down. So.
Was there a moment that was close for you? About a close call and maybe could have potentially ended the trip?
Honestly, like the one that I was a bit nervous about was Devil's Nook, and that was maybe 2 or 3 hours into the swim on the first day. And like I say, that's the point where there's lots of kayak tourists in New Zealand, and the kayakers who know what they're doing don't usually get in trouble there, but they sometimes do. But the ones who aren't that experienced often have to get rescued there. So even an inexperienced kayaker is going to be faster than a swimmer, even a reasonably good one. So smashing into the wall there was quite a concern, but my support kayaker guided me right into the exact line that I wanted to go to, and it worked perfectly. It was probably the couple hundred meters that I was sprinting was probably my favorite couple hundred meters of swimming I've ever done. And then shortly after that, there was the biggest rapids I'd ever swam through. And when I looked up, my lead kayaker, I actually overheard him, because I was stopped eating an energy gel. He came over the radio and he said, "Yeah, get ready for a really, really big rapids. This one's a little bigger than we thought." And as I was, looking up, doing my head up freestyle, heading into the rapid, I was like, "Oh, this could be a lot of fun, or it could go wrong." But honestly, when I was getting tossed about by the river, it's a survival thing, and you just go with it. I was having a lot of fun, and there was never any danger. And then there was 2 or 3 whirlpools I had to get out of. When you get caught in a whirlpool, I've figured out in previous river swims that what you do is when you're doing freestyle, heading down river, you flip over onto your back, let it toss you about a little bit, and then sprint like mad. After you've gotten on your back for, I can't really work out the hydrodynamics of it, but I worked out to get out of a whirlpool, allow it to spin you, flip on your back. As you come out again, like, coming towards the front of the whirlpool, then you flip over on your belly and sprint to high heaven. And depending on the whirlpool, and there's a lot of big ones in the Clutha, you'd be sprinting for a good 30 seconds to a minute or so. Like I say, if you've been swimming for hours, that you've done that repeatedly, that starts to be a big deal. It gets fatiguing, of course.
Take us through finishing this experience. You said 4.5 days. You got a couple kayakers with you, and I'm sure they were excited about the opportunity too to paddle the entire Clutha River. Not sure if they had done that before, but what were you doing to kind of recover each day? And I assume camping at night or stopping pre-planned stops, or just kind of seeing how far you get.
We had pre-planned stops, and this was one of the things because you don't know the exact, because no one had ever done it. It took me a long time to map out where I was planning on stopping each day, and the format was I'd swim for several hours in the morning, get out and have lunch, and wait for about an hour and a half, and then get back in and swim. So I was swimming about 8 hours or so, give or take, each day. I got the exact distance that I wanted to pretty much every day. Like I was prepared that there might be, when it was time to get out, I might have to go downriver to the hotel and then come back to the same point I got out, and start the next day, or backtrack. But that actually never needed to happen. Except for the last day, I planned to swim 88 kilometers, and we were starting to run out of daylight, so I only got 84. Yeah, so except for that, the last day, I didn't need to do any backtracking. That's partly due to experience, but also a very welcome fluke that I happened to get that right every time.
Are you more impressed with your ability to swim the river or to plan this whole trip? Because I know it took like almost a year to plan.
Yeah, for me, I've had, I describe a few of them in my book, more than a few. I've had no shortage of adventure mishaps. Most were comedic, some were a bit dangerous, and some were not so good at all. For me, because I've had my share of mishaps, and in retrospect, most of them were funny, I was a bit concerned that this would be the most dangerous adventure that I'd be on, and the fact that I was the first one to ever do it. I was concerned that something catastrophic could go wrong, and I was prepared, at any time that, we'd have to call it off, I mentally prepared myself that, maybe I get 1 or 2 days in, and if we had a storm or, something like that, well, we wouldn't be able to finish. But the weather smiled on me the whole time, and there wasn't any problem with that. But yeah, it was one of those adventures that I was really surprised. Nothing, except for a few funny little things that didn't matter, nothing went wrong. And for me, I did have confidence that I'd be physically able to do it with my years of triathlon background and all the adventuring I've done. But it was the logistics that I was more concerned about. And fortunately, I gave myself plenty of time. So it's fair to say I'm probably equally pleased with myself that I logistically planned it and nothing went wrong as I did, as I am pleased with myself that I was able to actually physically do it.
And I assume that you were pretty grateful to the two kayakers for taking the time out of their lives and get this done. It seems like quite an adventure for them too.
Yeah, I mean, they were keen kayakers, and as soon as they heard from on the Facebook messages that I put up saying, "Hey, this is my idea," they messaged me, and we got to know each other, and they were absolute professionals. And one of them was an emergency room nurse, and both were highly trained kayak instructors, both flat water and whitewater, and emergency rescue and stuff like that in kayaks. So they really knew what they were doing. But fortunately, except for their paddling skills, I didn't need them to use any of their rescue skills. There was no point. I mean, I was prepared at some points where, we had safety plans for if I get stuck in a rapid or a whirlpool, they'd come fish me out and pull me to safety. But fortunately, with the training I did and the sprinting and the comfort in the rough water that I had, that was never necessary.
Tell us about the process of writing a book for this. It obviously was a big enough experience for you to want to tell a bigger story about it. When did you decide to write a book? And tell us maybe some things that are in the book.
Yeah, well, my book is called Downriver Nomad. And to be honest, writing a book is something I've wanted to do for a very long time. I've always had at the back of my mind at some point I'm going to write a book. Probably my mom's an English teacher, so that's probably where that love of writing comes from. And, as I got more into my triathlon and marathon swimming and racking up no shortage of funny stories and meeting all these interesting characters that I've met all over the world, I thought, I'll write a book someday. And the barriers to that, were, it's fair to say I'm a reasonably good swimmer, but I'm not an elite athlete. Like, I'm not a former Olympian or anything like that. And one of the barriers I had mentally was, well, who'd read a book about little old me? And then I think it was 2019, my wife published her first book, and that was an inspiration. I finished the Clutha, and I thought, one of the thoughts I had as we were having a pizza celebration after we finished the last day, I thought, this would make a really epic conclusion to an adventure biography. And then scarcely a month later, we had the first COVID-19 lockdown. And when I realized on the second day that, they weren't kidding, and we really were going to be locked down, I thought, okay, well, I'm not going to become a Netflix junkie. Sat down, and my lockdown experience, the first 7 weeks was a pretty harsh lockdown here in New Zealand. That first one, we were allowed to go out, so I'd spend about 2 or 3 hours a day cycling or running, and another hour or so doing yoga, and the rest of the time during that 7 weeks was I got the habit of writing. And I wrote my story starting in triathlon and a lot of the challenges I've had, like as I was finding my feet in the sport, my father went off the rails, and he's unfortunately succumbed to alcoholism and drug abuse and turned pretty violent. And one of the shifts that I had in my life, and it was a particular triathlon in Nova Scotia, Canada, where I had my first physical fight with him because he attacked me. And a few days later, I was standing on the start line, wondering how that was going to affect me and, what direction my own life was going to go. And just in that moment, I just decided, right, I can either be, succumb to that path or I can try to be the best triathlete I can. And that was the first time I did really well in a triathlon. I just said, to myself, F it, I'm leaving everyone behind. And I didn't think I'd stand a chance at age 17 against the top guys on the bike and the run, but I knew I was becoming a good swimmer. Basically what happened was I annihilated everyone in the swim, and only the top pro triathlete passed me, and I nearly ran him down, and that was a big shift in my life. So I wrote all about that. So I'd gone from, my first triathlon, which I described in detail, which is pretty comedic because, it was an unmitigated disaster because I didn't know what I was doing at age 13. And
13
so,
years old, wow.
a few years later, that happened. And, I went on to describe going to the national championships, and I went to the world championships in Perth, Australia at age 21. Yeah, and then I just ended up describing a lot of my other adventures, including a really wild trip to Mongolia my wife and I did. And, going to Bhutan and Ironman across the outback where, I got approached by a brown snake while I was changing a flat tire, and then described my shift to adventuring. But one thing that happened during my time in Australia, I wasn't sure if I was going to write about this in my book, but my wife and I were unable to have children. And I wrote about it, but not sure that I was going to put it in my book. And we had a failed adoption attempt that took over 5 years. And the reason I decided to include it in a book about an endurance sport was that 5-year process was what I've described as the only endurance endeavor that ever really, that was the first time I ever gave up. Well, it wasn't giving up. It was forced upon us. We had to because we were going bankrupt and a variety of other reasons why we were no longer eligible to adopt because we were trying to adopt from overseas, and a federal judge in one of the countries we tried to adopt from shut the program down because of corruption, which is valid. I described that process as well. It was shortly after that I, realized I was not feeling as competitive as I used to. Part of that might be that, not 21 anymore. But part of it was having had adventures in places like Mongolia and Bhutan. I was just craving more adventure than chasing best times. Combination of probably not going to get best times anymore. And having done triathlons of all distances and all that, yeah, I thought that was a story to tell. So much like being a triathlete who was, I held my own in a lot of events, but I was never the world champion. I asked myself when I sat down to write the book, if I know for a fact I'm not going to make money by doing this, do I still want to? And turns out the answer was yes. So I set a joke goal for myself, right? The goal is to have 7 people not name my mother read it. Turns out, well, I didn't have any illusions of New York Times bestseller or anything, but a lot more than 7 people have read it. And, well, a lot of people have given me really good feedback. So really proud of the work and started to write my second book.
Well, tell us about the second book then. What does that entail?
It's in the early days, and one thing I can say is that when you sit down to write a book, what you think you're going to write isn't always what you actually write. I mean, I did intend to write about the Clutha and stuff, but I didn't intend to include the childless thing. But I'm really fascinated with building up resilience and overcoming, life challenges. And I just been doing a lot of reading about resilience, and in certain circles, resilience seems to be lacking in society these days. A lot of people looking for increased safety, and I'm just not convinced that you can make yourself as safe as possible. And I just think that at some point, life becomes chaotic and sometimes can be catastrophic. So the theory that I have about writing my next book is writing more adventures that I've been doing since the Clutha. I think I'm going to interview a whole bunch of endurance athletes in New Zealand, ranging from marathon swimmers to triathletes and adventurers and stuff like that, and talk to them about whatever story they've overcome. And I'm interested in subjects like, alcoholism, whether it's a family member or themselves, because obviously I had personal experience with my father with that, and overcoming grief, overcoming, some severe trauma, things like that. And just tying that into another book about, how endurance sport and adventures can help you move on after you've had a trauma or, in whatever way. So, I've just become really fascinated with the reading about resilience, and I've been listening to a lot of audiobooks on the subject and reading about it. And so that's it's going to take me at least a year or more to write that, but because I work full time plus I adventure full time. That's the theory that I've got to write for the next one. But I was really happy with my book, Downriver Nomad. Downriver, obviously, for the obvious reasons of swimming the Clutha and my nomadic life. But One thing I described was that I think river swimming for me became like a metaphor for life because like different parts of your life, there's, smooth waters, and then there's rapids, and then there's whirlpools, and then there's, you never know what's coming, and you just got to adapt to the twists and turns that's thrown at you. But in the end, we don't actually control anything. And, you can't control a river flow. And one thing that happened just, I think it was 3 weeks out from before I did the Clutha, we had a severe storm in New Zealand. And we weren't sure up until a few days before that the waters were going to subside because the Clutha normally flows at around 600 cubics, which is cubic meters of water per second. And the kayakers canceled their tours at 800 cubics because of danger. And the storm that we had so much water, the Clutha got up to 3,200 cubics. So, it could have been, the whole swim could have been called off. Yeah, it could have been called off before, that would have been a suicide mission. I would never have done that. So, just realizing with river swimming, like I've had a lot of river swims since then that, like I swam the Buller River for the second time. And, I had to reschedule that 7 weeks in a row because, first the river was running actually too low. It was too shallow. Didn't have enough rain. And then we had too much rain. And then my kayaker got COVID. And then, there was 7 weeks before I did it for the second time back in January. And so it just really became apparent to me that, swimming a river was like swimming through my life. So I described that a lot in my book. And while I couldn't quote the song, I found out as I was writing a book, you're not allowed to quote song lyrics without written permission from the artist. And but there's a song that was popular when I was a teenager. Garth Brooks sings a song called "The River," and I think I was 16 or 17 when he first released that, and it always spoke to me. One of the lyrics that he had was, "Don't you sit up on the shorelines and say you're satisfied. Choose to chance the rapids and dare to dance the tide." That really spoke to me when I was a teenager, and then fast forward 30 years, that's literally what I was doing on the Clutha.
Garth Brooks, now you're speaking my language. I'm from the South, and funny enough, I'm recording this in my truck right now.
Yeah,
and the only albums in my CD player, because they're the only CDs I still have, are Garth Brooks. I've got a 5-space CD player. Every one of them is a Garth Brooks album. So you're speaking my language. That's awesome. I know the song. I know what you're talking about, and I tell you what, I love the idea of the river being life. This is all, I try not to talk too much. I let the guests talk, but I got to tell you, I treat this show a lot like a river. Anytime someone asks me the philosophy of a podcast, I say, just be like water. You go down, you flow down. A lot of people are talking about the summit all the time, going towards that summit, being the one on top. I was like, I just treat it like a river. Let it flow. I let the conversations go where they go and try to direct it, try to avoid pitfalls, try to avoid rapids. Same thing with just how I operate it and how I try to live. So it's interesting to hear that you see those same connections too.
Absolutely.
Them obviously on a much deeper level than I do.
Yeah, well, I mean, like I say, I've always had the love of the water, and for, that song really spoke to me, 30 odd years ago, whenever it came out. Don't know the exact year, but I remember being a teenager and, when that came out, and, not being from the southern states, being from Canada, a number of my friends used to make fun of me for listening to Garth Brooks. But I didn't mind. I'm quite happy to be a nerd. Yeah, I still have that song, like you, I listen to it regularly, and like I say in my book, I wanted to quote the lyrics, but I found out that was illegal without written permission. So I did email his agent, but the agent never got back to me. I'm reasonably confident Garth would have given me permission had he got the message, but he never did.
Oh yeah, I know he's pretty particular of his song licenses, but I tell you what, I think he'd have been okay with it. But well, Rob, tell us a little bit about before we close out. Just, is there a quick story or something you could share about why adventure is so important for anyone to pursue, not just a full-time triathlete or someone that gets sponsored to do this, but for someone like you that has a full-time job that has lived all over the world? Why is it important for us to have these goals and have these things that we aspire to, that where we might be the only person in the world doing this?
One of the mentalities I found particularly when I was living in Brisbane, for whatever reason, the crowd that I seemed to be associated with during the few years I lived in Brisbane in Australia, they seem to have this mentality of, they want it to be the best, they want it to be the greatest, and if you weren't going to be the best, and if you weren't going to, do the greatest thing ever, why bother? Sit down and go home. And I always found that a bit troubling. Like, I was talking to a mate of mine who I was running with one day, and he said that he was going to go trek to base camp there, at Everest. And I just made a joke. I said, "There's no way you can just trek to base camp without trying to climb Everest." And he goes, "Yeah, I'm probably going to come back and be a mountain climber." And I just asked him, "Do you want to be a mountain climber?" And he said, "No, but it's just the biggest, baddest thing that's out there." So I said, "So why would you want to climb Everest if you don't want to climb mountains?" And it was just about, ticking off a list rather than actually a genuine love of it. So, I've just really encouraged, what I tried to get across in my book was, I hope I inspire a few people to, if you're not going to be the biggest, and you're not going to be the best, and maybe not going to be the only one to ever do anything, do something, I should say, just go out and do it anyway. I mean, if the mountain's already been climbed 1,000 times, go do it anyway. And I just think that, I mentioned my fascination with resilience that I've started to write about. In modern society, I think we've gotten so comfortable that a lot of people are miserable. And I mean, there's no one answer to having a happy life that's free of depression or anything like that. But I think that having a challenge and having a worthy goal and having, not necessarily a goal, but like just something that's really hard sitting in front of you, whether that's climbing a mountain, whether that's running a marathon or doing a triathlon, or in my case, swimming a river, or just anything that you can think of. And it doesn't matter whether it's the 2K swim at the beach or the the 5K run, or the Boston Marathon or the Hawaii Ironman. Just putting something out there that's in front of you that you don't necessarily know you can do, something that's hard, worth striving for. I just think it gives people, a lot of focus, a lot of discipline, and when you do something that you didn't know you could do, I just think a lot of satisfaction, and good things carry over into all the other parts of your life. And if you can, transfer some of that discipline that it takes to do an endurance sport or an endurance adventure of any kind, I think that gives you a lot of tools to have a life that you really enjoy. And I think a lot of people want to set themselves up for an easy cruise through life. And, and I just don't think that's possible. I think that's an unrealistic expectation because, there's a quote that I really like. It's about the ocean, not a river, but, life is like the ocean. You're smooth sailing one day and you're smashing on the rocks the next. And then it's what you do when you're trying to avoid smashing on the rocks. And having an endurance sport goal or, an adventure goal that you strive towards, it gives you the tools you need, I think, in many instances at least, to keep going when life just is not going your way and something from mildly upsetting to catastrophic. So yeah, that's my take on why do any endurance challenge, whether you're going to be the first, second, or 1,000th person to do it. I think it's worth doing if it's a challenge.
Follow-up question, because that makes me very interested. I know we got to go soon, but do you think, because we hear a lot about, adventure teaches you the tools, the tools you need to get through things in life. Do you think having an adventure, a long-term one, especially like almost a year of planning and execution like this river expedition for you, do you think that helps you kind of smooth over those turbulent times as well, as far as anything that might happen within that year, because you have this goal in mind? Like, say something bad happens at work or you lose a family member or something. Can that not only give you the tools to get through those times before or after the experience, but also while you're preparing for it?
Absolutely, because basically, I think that human beings by nature, I think we need something to aim for. And I think people can get confused. If you aim up, that means you have to aim to be the best. And if you don't end up being the best, it wasn't worth it. And I think that's a big mistake. But just having something to aim for, some kind of sense of purpose and some kind of sense of accomplishment when things go sideways, like whether it's dealing with a loss of a loved one or, just lose your job or, something really crappy happens, COVID, for example. A lot of people had, mental health crises during lockdowns. And I didn't find it easy. When we were locked down here, having something to aim for, in my case, was writing a book, and also ingrained habit of riding my bike, running or swimming or doing yoga gives you a sense of purpose when you can't go out and do the normal things.
Love it, Rob. I love it. I totally agree. So, now that you realize you can swim rivers for hundreds of miles, what's next for you as far as the next big adventure, or is there one yet?
There's lots. I've got a 6-day triathlon planned in Wanaka. We're going to swim the upper Clutha twice, which is 44K. And we're going to run a lot of the mountain tracks and the alpine running tracks and hiking tracks in Wanaka. Or, being up on top of the beautiful mountains, looking down on the crystal blue Lake Wanaka is going to be amazing. And doing the mountain bikes. So we're going to do a 6-day triathlon in Wanaka. I mentioned that I'd like to swim the Fovo Strait and then run around the Stewart Island track. I think it's called the Rakiura track, if I remember correctly. One of the things I never did when I was living in my hometown, there's a river that flows into my hometown. It's called the Humber River. And I would compare the size of that to the Clutha. It's not quite as long, but the current strength and all that would be pretty similar. So I've actually got a goal to go back to my hometown and swim that. And I actually made a homemade documentary of my Clutha River swim. It's on YouTube. If you just search YouTube Clutha River Swim, you can watch a 52 or 53-minute, and I stress that it's homemade, not Netflix, level documentary. It was just strung together out of our GoPro. But yeah, I made that, and about 3,000 people have watched that, and including a guy in Colorado and another guy in Utah. They saw it, and they've invited me over when I save up some money for international travel, now that we can do that again, to swim some of the Canyonlands through Utah and Colorado. So that's a goal I've got in mind as well.
Oh man, that'll be beautiful.
Yeah, so I'm really keen on, basically, I don't have the big marathon swimming goals like for, swimming the English Channel, because that's, quite polluted and very expensive. I'm more keen on having a really good adventure with a small group of, like-minded people and seeing beautiful scenery. And I imagine, I've never been there, but I imagine the Canyonlands in Utah and Colorado are pretty amazing to see. So I'd love to swim through that. And of course, probably do a hike or a run or mountain biking around there after as well to make it a triathlon.
Wilderness triathlons. We didn't get much into that, but that's something that you are also doing. And funny enough, I've done one as well. I did a just wilderness triathlon this was about a year ago now. I can't believe it's been a year, but I absolutely loved it. Yeah, well,
I call it triathlon tramping down here, or if I'm talking to someone outside of New Zealand, triathlon trekking, where, like I say, marathon swimming, cycle touring and bike packing is something I'm big on because I love the adventurous aspect of that. And then, alpine running or hiking to make it a triathlon. And because my wife is also she's not a swimmer, but she's a cycle tourist and a hiker, that's something that we can do as an adventurous thing together. Two out of the 3 stages we can often do together.
We swap out the swimming in lakes for kayaking because of the gators. There's too many gators. Quite a few.
That's one thing I won't do is I'm not interested in swimming with alligators or crocodiles in Australia.
No.
Yeah, no, that's like I said, in New Zealand, there's nothing out there in the wilderness that thinks you look like lunch. So that's one of the advantages we have down here.
Well, Rob, I just want to say thank you for jumping on, and thank you for telling us just about your experience, Downriver Nomad. I would love to learn more about this story. I actually placed an order already, so I'm looking forward to getting the book in a couple days. Okay. And I'm excited to give this one a look because I just think your story is so relatable. So many of us probably have the same amount of time off you do, and probably have the same amount of access that you do, and you're making it happen, and you're getting these adventures. And so many people that listen to the show are not aspiring to be professionals, but they want to have the highest quality adventure possible. And I think that can be found absolutely anywhere. So thanks for being an example and telling us about it.
Well, I really appreciate you having me on. I really hope you enjoy my book, and I hope some of your listeners might enjoy my book as well. You can get some of the links. My website is adventuresoutsidethelanes.com, and there's links to buy my book on most of the online book retailers there. And if you read it, I really appreciate it. Hope you enjoy it, and feel free to reach out and tell me what you think.
First of all, thank you so much for listening. It means the world to us that you choose to listen to this show. If you'd like to help us further, you can leave a review on iTunes, share us with your friends, your family. It goes a long way to grow in the show. You can also support us financially through patreon.com/adventuresportspodcast. Link is in the show notes. And also, if you have an idea of who could be a good guest for the show, we're always looking for people to tell their story about the outdoors or adventure. So if you know someone, please reach out. Email us at info@adventuresportspodcast.com. And until then, get out there and have some fun.
You're finally at that hot new spot, the one your friends keep raving about, sitting across from your date. It's going...
Another round?
Really well. And that dish you've been dying to try? Oh, it's headed your way. You can smell it, hear it sizzling fresh off that skillet as it comes closer, closer, and served. Go ahead, enjoy. After your phone sneaks a bite first. When you're with Amex, it's not if it's going to happen, but when. American Express. Don't live life without it.
Hey, it's me, your Uncle Cooper. Sorry to interrupt your music. I do love music, especially when it's set at a reasonable volume. You know, music is really only as good as your speakers. The same is true for minivans. A minivan is only as good as the tires it sits on. And the button on the screen there, it agrees with me. If you click on it, it'll bring you to all the Cooper minivan tires that'll make your minivan a really good minivan. Go with the Coopers! Cooper!